HBO is developing a series, and there's a very good producer named Scott Rudin who's working on it, and I've been somewhat involved. There's not too much more to say. I mean, it's many. We've made some progress, and I've been very interested in the conversation, but we're many stages away from having an actual TV program. I don't watch very much television. I've never had HBO, and I've become, it's funny because as I've become a little more interested in these things, thinking about the prospect of maybe working on my own show maybe someday. So I watched some of Friday Night Lights, which is the great recent sports program about football, high school football. But I don't. But all the great shows that everyone talks about, I haven't actually seen them. Although I believe that they're quite good, and it's quite an interesting. The TV series is such a more interesting thing for a writer than a film. If my book was going to be made into a film, that would be great, but it wouldn't be very interesting for me because I think the process is just cutting, trying to get down. But the way that these TV shows can play out over 30 hours, 40 hours, 50 hours, I mean, it's not a novel, but there is something quite novelistic about the span of time, and just the amount of work that you can do with your characters. Of course, what you can't do is work outside of your characters. It's of course a very different thing to have the words coming out of people's mouths.
Mediapart.
But I did not think myself to be working in the tradition of the baseball novel, really, at all. I just read Bernard Malamud, The Natural. I just read this book over the summer, just now. It's really good, but I had never read it before. And that's. I mean, I love Philip Roth, but that's one of my least favorite of his books. So I didn't really have models of baseball novels that I felt oppressed by or wanted to emulate, or there just really weren't any. The campus novel, there are a lot of campus novels, and I think I wasn't. There are a lot of campus novels, and a lot of them are in a more satirical mode and tradition, which certainly mine is not. But I guess I've just, there are an awful lot of American and also English novels set on college campuses, and I certainly had some of those in mind from time to time as I was working. Even in the U.S., my publisher did not want to tell anyone that the novel was about baseball, even in the United States. When the designer designed the cover, the direction was no baseball, and the jacket copy and everything, because although of course there are a lot of people in the U.S. who know a lot about baseball, it's perceived to be and mostly true that these are not the same people who read novels, and so. So my publisher, I think my publisher was quite right that to appeal to readers in the U.S., you also had to kind of tell them, it's not really about baseball. Even if you don't care one whit about baseball, you can still, enjoy the characters and the drama among the characters. So, yeah, you don't need to know about baseball. the university thing is quite interesting because it is a very American thing, and I think that's one of the. It's one reason why I was maybe more interested in the campus novel than in the baseball novel, is because I think that college is such a strange and important part of American life. For a lot of for people who are lucky enough to attend all these thousands of schools, there's something sort of utopian and idyllic about these places, and I often think that the kind of American utopian impulse has been kind of channeled into universities, and so it's kind of kept in these confined places, and you get to sort of live in utopia for 4 years, and then you at the end of these and you build a whole life there, and it's very self-enclosed and provides everything, and then at the end of 4 years you get kicked out and you have to go enter into a much more threatening economic and social world. So that's one thing that I was quite interested in the book was, I think that's what a lot of the characters in the book are dealing with, the difference between the kind of idyllic life at Westish College and a much more frightening prospect that they see outside. I didn't want to spend all my time writing a book that only took place on a baseball diamond. And I think that's why President Affenlight and Pella Affenlight came kind of into the cast of characters for the book very early. I think one of the things that really initially appealed to me about them is that neither one of them cares anything about baseball. They get drawn into the team and the season because of their relationships with the friendships and romances with the players on the team, but they don't actually know anything or care anything about the game. And so when they entered the story, it allowed me to kind of widen the lens, and although of course the baseball season always kind of hangs in the background, I think of it much more as a novel about the relationships between these 5 people. And the college and baseball are just a kind of the setting for what plays out in this kind of 5-person drama. Of course, you don't think about it as a symbol when you're writing it. You really want to, because the first thing you have to do, whether it's whaling or baseball or what, is that you have to get the baseball right, and make that all as kind of accurate and exciting and compelling as possible. Certainly, what I was interested in, the very first idea for the book was to write about this crisis that happens to Henry, this kind of crisis of confidence and self-doubt that he goes through just as he's on the precipice of real success. And I was interested in that, not necessarily as a metaphor, but because it did seem very analogous to the struggles that I was having trying to become a writer, and also I think to the struggles that anyone goes through in the course of their career or their life, or so that baseball problem, that thing that happens to Henry, appealed to me because it did seem resonant with all different parts of life. Henry's crisis is, it's this crisis of self-doubt, and I think it's something that everyone goes through at some point. Certainly a writer goes through it very often, or any artist, or probably anyone in their profession or private life. Why I wanted to write about an athlete, one main reason is that it played this for an athlete. It, exactly as you say, it's very public. Nobody wants to read a novel about me, the writer, in my room fighting against self-doubt, pounding my fist on the table for 5 years, and that's very boring. But when Henry has this crisis in the novel, it's very physical, it's very public, and the fact that it's public makes it very dramatic, because has to kind of face himself and his demons in a really deep way, and he has to do it on the field. Anyone who wants can come watch. There's a moment in the book when President Affenlight is thinking about what has happened to Henry, and he thinks that it's almost cruel that spectators are allowed to come and see this kind of breakdown happening. And I agree. Steve Blass was the first player to have this crisis of self-doubt, at least the first player who everyone noticed that he was having this crisis, and it was he was a great player, and then a year later he was retired. It just stopped his career dead in his tracks. And it's happened to many players since. So I was very interested in why didn't it happen before? Why did it happen before and no one noticed? Or is it a kind of cultural symptom in some kind of way? And I don't know the answer to that question. But so I thought it interesting that it happened to him in 1973, which is often, I'm often a little dubious about these kind of marking historical eras in this way. But certainly many people kind of trace in the U.S. a kind of crisis of confidence in the U.S. and in the American government to Watergate and to the Vietnam War, and so somewhere in there was some important shift.
Mediapart.
Fielding fielding is basically the act of catching the ball. So I think in English it has this kinds of undertones of being open to life and accepting life, and being able to deal with whatever comes to you and comes at you, in the way that the ball comes at you in the game. So you have to kind of be. So I think that's how I think of it. The kind of secondary meanings in English. I think the book is very much about reading. I think because many of the characters have these books that serve as touchstones in their lives. And for Affenlight, it's Melville and Whitman and Emerson, the great 19th century American writers. Mike Schwartz is writing his thesis about the Stoic philosophers, and so Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus are very important to him. And you can see these characters, and so they really use these books in their daily life. Mike writes quotes from Marcus Aurelius on a big poster and puts them up in the weightlifting room. They really, and of course Affenlight really lives his life kind of according to what to Melville, and so and for Henry, and it's one reason I like the book within the book, The Art of Fielding, because even Henry, who's not a literary guy at all, it's maybe the only book he's ever read start to finish, but he too has this literary touchstone. Then I think what happens is that for all these characters, they have these books that guide them in their lives, and then each of them kind of reaches a point in his or her life when these books aren't helping anymore, and they have to find a new path on their own, really. And I didn't plan it out that way, but I see that as something that really kind of goes for every character in the book. It's a difficult problem for the writer. I mean, of course, there's one little subgenre of the novel that's that's explicitly kind of political or allegorical in a political way. Most of the time, there is a great risk of being didactic, or of just being too simple, because I think that the process of writing fiction works very differently from the processes in your mind that argue or that think about politics in a daily way. I think you're trying to, in fiction, you're writing without purpose in a lot of ways. And I think the novels that provide the best social commentary are simply novels written by people who have really studied the society and have really deep and interesting thoughts about it, and then these thoughts emerge while they're writing in this purposeless way. If that makes any sense. But I think it's very difficult to set out to write a novel that's going to say something in particular about the society. I think America is a lot like it was when I started the book in 2000. I mean, some major events have happened, most of them quite terrible, but they're not actually very different from the things that happened before. I don't think we've entered any kind of different historical era, and I think I think it's dangerous. Of course, a writer wants to. I think the most important thing for a novel writer is to write in a way that captures the contemporary world. I mean, that's why that gives the reader a kind of window onto parts of life that he or she kind of perceived, but couldn't entirely perceive because they didn't quite have the words for it. And I think the novelist kind of gives those words to the contemporary world. But at the same time, I think it's dangerous for a novelist to be too to want to be too contemporary in this historical sense. To say, all right, this historical event has happened. It's hot. Everyone's talking about it. I'm going to write a novel about it. That happens a lot, and I think it's quite dangerous. And what you see over the long course of the novel is that the best novel about the Civil War gets written by Faulkner, 70 years later, or the best novel about World War II gets published in the 60s, and because these things have to kind of emerge naturally over time. But I didn't. It's unfortunately. Unless you were quite naive, I don't think any of the things that happened in the U.S. in the 2000s were terribly surprising.
Mediapart.
I don't think there are very strict schools of American fiction or the American novel. The way that maybe there's never been quite such strict schools, but I think there were times in the past where you could trace some fairly thick lines between different sort of movements or groups of people. It's quite. I think it's quite difficult to do so these days. I think you have there are various trends, or not trends, but strands of the literature that were around 30 or 40 years ago, that that the postmodernism and and minimalism, and then you have like an increasing number of kind of immigrant or just non-white novelists writing books. And I mean, in some ways I think these strands have become very mixed together, and so it becomes a little bit hard to pluck things out. One thing that I have been thinking a lot about lately is MFA programs, creative writing programs, because for my magazine N+1, I'm editing a book about the publishing world and MFA programs, and it's funny to travel around and have conversations with people first in Germany and then here in France last night about these programs in places. So, for instance, in Germany, I guess there are two creative writing schools, and they're very sort of each doctrinaire in their own way. And so a lot of the Germans I met just hated the writing that came out of these places. Whereas in the U.S., the MFA programs they've had a big effect over the long term, but they don't. But I think they serve more to kind of mix everyone up than they do to kind of have separate schools have very distinct personalities. I spent 11 years writing the book, and yeah, I think I don't know. I'm very interested in storytelling, and I think a lot of American writers are. I'm sort of. I mean, I think it's very difficult to produce a novel that has a kind of satisfying narrative structure. I think that's actually a very hard thing to do. Of course, you can do that without writing a very good book, and there you can go to the airport and buy a lot of books that have I don't know. Well, some of them don't really. I don't. But you can. There are a lot of kind of genre authors who write in a very cliche or who write a very cliched manner, but have this structure part down. I think it's another reason why it's a kind of interesting moment for the novel, because I think we passed through that kind of postmodern era of saying, actually, and which comes from the postmodern American novel, which of course comes from French theory, which says, wait a second, this is an artificial structure that is being created here. It's not a seamless, view of the universe. It's all these little markings on a piece of paper. And there was a lot of really good, really interesting, kind of American writing produced in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s that kind of acknowledged this and kind of turned the story inside out. And I mean, people have certainly, and I don't know if and then I think that David Foster Wallace was a kind of crux in this. I mean, there are other writers the same, but he's one example of a writer who I think came just after the high postmodernism, and so knew all the tricks of how to expose the structure, but was finding kind of new purposes for that. Or these tricks were just tricks that he had in his bag of tricks to use or not use. And now I think you're seeing writers who know those tricks and have read all those books and have those tricks available to them, but oftentimes choose not to use them. One of the best teachers who I had in college was a really great American poetry critic named Helen Vendler, and Professor Vendler would always the kind of foundation of her criticism was that poetry exists to give pleasure, and so the kind of main function of the critic is to figure out what sort of what sort of pleasure this is, how is this pleasure being delivered, how is it being received, how can we kind of characterize it? And that's what her whole career has been. So in that sense, I think it's quite true. Entertainment is a quite problematic word, I think, in our culture, because it suggests a very passive reception of things, and of course there are quite difficult novels that are quite beautiful, but you can sit down and feel lazy and say, this is not entertaining me, because it requires quite a bit of work on the part of the reader. But I do think that at base, nobody has to write a novel, nobody has to read a novel. It's a pleasurable act.